smart, born equal, born different, Adam Rutherford tackles the genetics of intelligence. Today he asks, are some people born smarter than others?
Genetics is more important than teaching. That is how the latest studies on the inheritance of intelligence were reported last autumn. The touch paper was lit, and the reaction, fireworks.
I mean, what happens if someone uses this sort of research just to go, OK, let's have streaming at birth? I mean, that sort of thing should scare us all.
It comes to the question of whether or not your genetic makeup should be something which is of significance. That is a fundamental moral question, and scientists don't really understand that moral dilemma.
Well, I am a scientist, and I want to understand. So, for all my liberal ideals, I'm going to risk being branded desperately naive or chronically politically incorrect. And here is why.
In the post-Second World War days of intelligence testing, it became complete anathema to suggest that genes are involved in anything. Well, the answer is either they are or they aren't. What you feel about it is neither here nor there.
Genetics is an important factor in how easily children find it to learn things, how intelligent they are. It doesn't say the environment's not important. So pushy parents, it could be helping their child. But if there are parents who don't recognize the genetic differences between children, if they think children are a blob of clay that you mold them to be whatever you want them to be, they should listen to this program because it's not true.
My mummy says I'm a miracle. Well, look at my face and it's plain to see. Ever since the day Doc chopped the umbilical cord, it's been clear there's no peer for a miracle like me.
And it means parents can't take all the credit and they can't take all the blame when things go wrong. There are these genetic differences.
One can hardly move for beauty and brilliance these days. It seems that there are millions of these, one in a million these days.
Miracle from Tim Minchin's musical Matilda. In this three-part series, we chart the rise and fall and rise again of the genetics of intelligence. Today, we'll hear how in the 21st century there's renewed interest in the inheritance of cleverness, the idea that some people are born smart, or at least smarter, an area of study which began more than a century ago with Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. In part 2, Born Equal, ideas of equality dominate in the post-war era, and scientists studying the genetic basis of intelligence were howled down. The social, not biological sciences reigned supreme. And in the final programme, Born Different, we'll explore what, if anything, all this might mean for educational policy. But first, today, I want to try and understand why recent studies of the genetics of intelligence have provoked such a fractious debate.
I'm very suspicious, not because I don't think that genetics plays a part, not because I don't think that nature has something to do with children's ability, but I think it's eugenics by the back door.
Melanie Phillips talking on Radio 4's Moral Maze. Reverend Giles Fraser worries that it could lead to streaming at birth.
I don't understand the science of genetics very well. Actually, I don't think any of us around this table understand the science of genetics terribly well. And actually, in that sort of a situation where there's so much we don't understand, I think it's quite right to have a high degree of suspicion about the way in which certain research can potentially be politicised and steered in a particular direction. And there's a long, long history of that having happened.
Well, Professor Robert Plomin from King's College London has been researching the genetics of intelligence for decades. He's one of the most prominent scientists working in this area today. And at the end of last year, he shared his scientific findings with advisors to our Education Minister, Michael Gove.
There are these genetic differences. It's not to say we should be fatalistic. You want to do all that you can for your children. But I thought it must be important for people to at least acknowledge that genetics is important, that the differences between children aren't just in the country they live in, the school they go to, or the parents' environment that they provide.
Have you seen his school report? He got a C on his report.
What?
We'll have to change his school. The teacher's clearly falling short.
She's just delightful, so hilarious and insightful. Might she be a little brighter than the norm? I know to boys it's frightful form.
Oh, it is frightful form to suggest one's child might be a little brighter than the norm. Everyone thinks their children are special, but saying your kid's a bit brighter than the rest is fairly obnoxious. To say it's inherited just adds insult to injury. To study these differences scientifically, well, who would choose to do that?
The study of the genetic influences on intelligence is a very difficult and politically charged field.
Peter Singer is a moral philosopher at Princeton University.
It is something of a minefield for scientists getting into that and for people who are going to discuss the policies that arise from that. That's partly because of the history and partly because of the current sensitivities and what it does to our moral and political ideals about human equality. Some cherished interpretations of equality are threatened by that. So that makes the area one in which you have to tread very delicately.
So, let me ask this very delicately. Should we be suspicious of the scientists who choose to enter this minefield?
I think, on the contrary, that understanding the basis of differences, both between individuals and between groups, could help us to rethink our policies. And, I mean, it might overcome some prejudices even, because if we realise that these things are the result of the genetic lottery, we may try to find ways of essentially making it up to people who lost out in that lottery.
And geneticist Steve Jones agrees.
It's interesting to look, for example, at things like ADHD, which it seems fairly clear has got, in some cases, has got some genetic basis. Why are we looking at the genetics of ADHD? We're looking at it not to blame these unfortunate children or to accuse their parents of being bad parents, which is what used to happen. We're there in an attempt to help the children and to help the families. And that seems to me just fine.
Yeah, you get no argument there from most people when you're referring to something like ADHD or diseases. But when you substitute that for something as emotive and complex as intelligence, all of a sudden the conversation stalls.
I can't really understand why that is, actually. We have to accept the facts as they appear. We have to be sure that we understand what those facts mean. And when it comes to inheritance of things like intelligence, I'm very far from certain that's true where the public is concerned. And then we have to decide from our own social and political views what to do with those facts. And those three items are surprisingly distinct from each other.
The science is easily misunderstood, and there are many fears and sensitivities. Here's Matthew Taylor, former advisor to Tony Blair, talking to Robert Plomin's co-author, Catherine Asbury, again on The Moral Maze.
It must have occurred to you that what would happen is exactly what has happened, which is that what is being talked about as a result of your research is the idea that this is science that can be used to sort children into the bright and the less bright, and that implicitly we might want to put more resources into the bright children so that, for example, we can compete more effectively on the global stage. Are you surprised at that interpretation of your work?
But Robert Plomin is adamant that he has thought through the possible policy implications of his research, and he insists that when he gave a series of lectures to Michael Gove's team at the end of last year, he went in with his eyes wide open.
It's really important to recognize no necessary policy implication follows from finding genetic influence. You don't have to be afraid of it, but to ignore it seems to be an incredible mistake.
The last time we spoke on this very subject was a few months back, and it was while you were in the middle of a hoo-ha in the press where both right and left had taken various aspects of your work in order to make a point. The science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not straightforward enough to just say, here's the data, do what you want with it.
Well, that's why for my 30 years of my career, I kept out of it. I just said, because what really turns me on, what gets me up in the morning, is the science of it. Whereas now, as I get older, I'm realizing, well, it is important that education begins to consider genetics. It must be important. Just at a philosophical level of recognizing that kids are not all the same. They differ for genetic reasons. Then when I was given this opportunity to talk to ministers at the Department for Education in a series of lectures on genetics, I thought, right, okay, I'm going to do that. This is my little attempt to try and bring these findings to a wider arena.
Do you feel like you had your hand burnt in doing that? Would you go back and talk to government if invited again?
I don't think I felt my hands were burnt at all. Every 10 years or so, I get involved in one of these sorts of hoo-has. I mean, this time it was much more intentional on my part, though, because I do want genetics and education to be used in the same sentence.
Fair enough, you might think, but there are historical reasons why we might worry about genetics and education being used in the same sentence. Let's not beat around the bush here. The Holocaust is undoubtedly the worst possible outcome of a eugenics program. The meaning of that word was forever changed by the events at Auschwitz and elsewhere. But long before that, eugenics, genetics, and the study of intelligence were all intimately linked. They represent three distinct ideas now, but the man who invented them all didn't see it that way. Just over 150 years ago, Francis Galton was keen to discover what made him so darn clever. Was it because his august family tree, comprising the Darwins and the Wedgwoods, appeared to be significantly smarter than the great unwashed?
Galton, like many of his predecessors and successors, was convinced that humankind was in a state of decline because people of high quality, himself of course included, geniuses as he called them, were having fewer children than people of low quality. And he measured quality in many different ways, some of which were really very forward-looking. But his main interest, without question, was in human behaviour, in what we would now call intelligence. And he was utterly convinced that high IQ, as we'd say today, ran in families, that, as we'd say today, that IQ was heritable, it was controlled by genes.
And in 1869, Galton wrote it all up in a book with the somewhat lacking in humility title, Hereditary Genius. We may find his attitude a bit irksome, but he and the statisticians that followed effectively invented human genetics. Cambridge statistician David Spiegelhalter.
You know, they really were the founders, but they are, you know, it's like having the slightly disreputable uncle. They also had some views, frankly, that would be pretty unacceptable now. And Galton invented the term eugenics, the idea of improving the race by selective breeding, you know, just like you would some peas. And so that meant that sort of fit people, you know, people like him, you know, should be encouraged to breed, and the unfit should be discouraged. It's ironic that he had no children, in fact.
Now, this is where it all gets a bit uncomfortable for me. I studied human genetics at University College London. The lab in which I worked was called the Galton Laboratory, the first human genetics lab on Earth, founded by the self-declared great man himself. Back in 1907, it was known as the Galton Eugenics Laboratory. So, Subhadra, this is the actual Galton collection?
This is indeed, yeah. It's on the 5th floor.
Subhadra Das is the curator of the Galton collection in the same building. You're not painting a particularly flattering portrait of this man whose lab we're actually standing in. Do you ever feel uncomfortable that your job is to curate someone who's not all that good?
I spend almost all my time worrying about the fact that I'm becoming an apologist for Galton. But it's one of the things that if we don't talk about it, we may potentially fall into the same trap again.
Galton was obsessed not only with measuring, but also with classifying people into different types. We have him to thank for the labels homosexual, criminal, and pervert. He shared many of his contemporaries' ideas about racial inferiority. And yes, he was enthusiastic about eugenics, along with a whole raft of respectable figures, including Winston Churchill, George Bernard Shaw, and Mary Stopes.
He definitely suffers from that. He suffers from this thing about being a controversial figure. But the sort of people that we would judge, you know, good in the history of science, so for example, Mary Stopes, who's most famous as a feminist with the liberation of women, the reason she was into birth control was because it would stop poor people, i.e. the people with the poorer genes, with the poorer faculties, reproducing. So we pick eugenics. And choose, which is eugenics. So we pick and choose our stories when it comes to historical figures. And she's held up as a beacon for feminism, but on the other side of that is this other story. And Galton is generally held up as a beacon for eugenics, but on the other side of him, he is the first person to try to quantify those aspects of our character, like intelligence and like behaviour, and also look at how they're passed on through the generations.
He will be forever associated with the idea of eugenics, the word that he coined, and a word that is now difficult to utter.
Cultural historian Matthew Sweet.
Or has been so since at least the 1940s.
It is toxic, but at the time, completely different culture, completely different feeling in society, and he was part of that.
Yes, I mean, the idea of eugenics was progressive. It began not as a way of getting rid of people who the state didn't like, which is the idea we certainly associate with it now, but as a way of improving people's lives. It really arose out of an anxiety that came at the end of the 19th century when it was discovered that recruits for the Boer War were failing their medical tests. And this created a bit of a panic, really, about whether or not the British race was degenerating. I mean, that was the terms that it was put in.
And we have our own fears of degeneration today.
The Education Secretary, Michael Gove, has said international tests showing that the performance of teenagers in the UK has stagnated
With the top 3 countries in the academic league tables all coming from Asia, we worry that the Brits are not as mentally fit as some of our economic competitors in the global marketplace.
500,000 15-year-olds from 65 countries were tested in reading, science and maths last year, and the UK finished in 26th place.
For some, it's no accident that there's renewed interest in the inheritance of intelligence, given the backdrop of our own contemporary fears of degeneration as we slip down the league tables. Others argue it's simply due to the weight of scientific evidence that has accumulated over the decades. Either way, there is concern about where this science might lead, and I believe at least some of this concern stems from the fact that this is an area of science which is all too easily misunderstood. The first line of attack is often this: intelligence is such an ill-defined concept, it's impossible to measure. But interestingly, however it's measured, and contemporary researchers do use a range of measures from IQ scores to GCSE results, they get the same results in terms of its heritability. The other criticism is that the science is based on some flawed assumptions. Time, I think, for some transparency about how scientists study the inheritance of intelligence and what exactly their findings mean. Almost all of the research in this area involves people who come in pairs. Robert Plomin.
Galton in the 1800s realized that there are 2 types of twins. One type is very, very similar. We now think of those as identical twins. And the other type is no more similar than any brother and sister. They share 50% of their genes. Galton didn't know quite all of that, but he got the idea there were these 2 groups of twins. And then people realized it's like a natural experiment, because if you have one group of twins where pair by pair they're clones of one another, 100% similar genetically, and then you have another group that are also twins, born in wombs at the same time and all that, and yet only share 50% of their genetic material, then if something's heritable, like intelligence, you'd have to predict that identical twins would be more similar than fraternal twins.
And is that what you find? You just published a huge study on something like, more than 10,000 twins. What do you get as a result when you look at such a large group of people?
Well, from those first studies in 1924, the first twin study of intelligence, all the way through well over 100 studies, probably 200 studies or so, the results are really quite consistent that intelligence, as it is measured with these intelligence tests, is about 50% heritable. That is, 50% of the differences between people can be ascribed to genetic, that is, DNA differences between them. We don't know what genes are involved. We just know that genetic variation is a very important factor in accounting for differences between people in intelligence. But I always like to emphasize that 50% isn't 100%, so we're not saying it's all genetic by any means, but 50% is a lot.
I guess the question that everyone really wants to know the answer to, particularly what parents want to know, is, are my children born smart, or am I going to make them smart, or how much of it is determined by my genes and how much is it determined by environment?
Yes, that's an essential point, and it's the number one source of confusion. And the answer is that's not a reasonable question. It is just incredibly important to emphasize that we're not talking about one individual child. We're talking about differences between children in a particular population.
So, intelligence is something like 50% heritable. This is a highly misunderstood term. It sounds like a normal word, but in fact has a very technical scientific meaning. Steve Jones.
What you have to realise is that the essential measure that we use is something called heritability. And that's not the same as saying this is genetic. Heritability, loosely put, is the proportion of the total variation in a population, IQ or height or anything else, which is due to genetic variation in that population.
So when it gets reported that the heritability of intelligence, however it's measured, is something like 70%, what does that mean?
Well, what usually gets reported is that intelligence is 70% inherited, which is a totally different thing. That sounds as if genes do 70% of the job and that schools do 30%. But that's not like that at all. We're talking about proportion of a variation which is genetic. So you've got to be quite careful about how you use the language.
It's just saying, overall, in the population, on average, genetics is important.
So, a century of twin studies confirms what most teachers and many parents have suspected for years. Schoolwork is harder for some children than for others. While little Jimmy sweats his guts out, little Johnny sails through school. It's not fair. But the science is clear. Intelligence is highly heritable, and that is a significant result. The implications, however, are not what you might think.
That's the irony, that the more you understand about genetics, the more important, not the less important, the environment seems. And I would like to believe that that would be true for IQ.
You can't change the genes you're born with. But that doesn't mean we have to be fatalistic.
The interesting question is, what do you do with the information? And there are two absolutely opposed and equally logical responses, one of which is spend all the money on the smart ones, and the other of which is spend all the money on the stupid ones. The question about what to do with the information about inborn weakness goes back to the Old Testament. It goes back even further than that, no doubt. It's a question of original sin. If you're born imperfect, and genetics tells us that we're all born imperfect in one way or another, what do? Are you condemned for that? Are you forgiven for it?
Forgiveness is the pathway to the welfare state. Condemnation is the road to eugenic hell. Matthew Sweet.
If you trace the road back from Auschwitz, you get to a kind of a fork in the road that leads somewhere else. And down that other path are the Beveridge Report, the national health, the welfare state, all of these things that have improved our lives immeasurably and continue to do so.
William Beveridge, chief architect of the welfare state and the NHS, was a fervent advocate of eugenics.
Without eugenics, there would be no free school meals. Without eugenics, there would be no welfare state. So a lot of the things we value the most have their roots in ideas that we don't quite dare to talk about, and that even the people who are now bringing these ideas back into the discourse are scared of.
You can see why this whole area of science is a minefield. And as for those scientists who go where angels fear to tread,
I think that often science goes wrong, not because it's malevolent, but because scientists are naive.
Yes.
And I think when scientists are in this area, they need to think deeply and in a sophisticated and moral way about the implications of what they're doing. And I'm afraid that in the study we're discussing, the recommendations come with it don't pass that test for me.
Matthew Taylor talking about Robert Plomin's research again on the moral maze. I can't pretend that the idea of the naive scientist doesn't vex me. The notion that scientists are always unaware or don't care about the issues is disingenuous. We are all responsible for these issues, and ignoring them, or worse, denying the evidence, will not pave the way forward. And perhaps our fears about how this science might be used tells us more about our lack of faith in politicians and society to make the right decisions than it does about the naivety or otherwise of the individual scientists engaged in this kind of research. And finally, there's another, more personal reason why I think some people react so irately to the very mention of genetics and intelligence. And it's this. Such an attitude may be great for the self-esteem of our little miracles, but it makes the news that there are losers as well as winners in the genetic lottery particularly unwelcome. But if we persist in pretending that all of our children are blessed with above-average intelligence, then there are consequences. Mother of two, Jill Boucher.
Watching children do their best and fail to achieve the top. And actually, if you're a middle-class parent, of course, all your friends' children are getting the A's. And that's very difficult. I mean, it was very difficult for our youngsters when, you know, it was all, oh, when did they sit their A-levels, you know, which university, oh, did they get a first, you know? And you say, oh, well, yes, he's gone to further education college, you know. And I learned not to be ashamed of this. I learned that this was success for my child and that it was worthwhile. And at the same time, I became very angry when I came up against... I can remember on one occasion going to a party of, you know, our... I don't know, perhaps when I was in my 50s or so, and somebody's child was there who had just sailed through Oxford and was talking in the most arrogant way about, you know, the people who really counted, who had done like she had and found learning very easy and got to university and things. And I tore her off a strip. I was so angry at the arrogance of it. And her parents have never forgiven me.
I've certainly witnessed something very similar.
I'm absolutely certain that some kids are born with greater ability to learn than others. And those people who deny the evidence in the name of equality and their bleeding hearts for all these children, I say, just think it through.
So, where does all this leave us today? The history is long and murky. The science is clear, but highly misunderstood. The policy implications are far from obvious. We loathe the idea of streaming at birth. We fear a eugenic dystopia. But the same ideas that led to Auschwitz also gave us the welfare state. This is a minefield.
I think we're in a very confused place. I think we're not really having the discussion. So the ideas swash around the culture, unrooted, and we have no sense of their provenance.
Social, political, historical and moral baggage by the caseload. But I don't believe that these are good enough reasons, any of them, for knee-jerk mistrust or outright rejection of the genetics of intelligence.
I think the people working in this field now who want us to apply genetic ideas to public policy need to come clean about the history of those ideas. They need to have a kind of therapy, actually, where they can come to terms with the pasts of their own discipline and acknowledge that the ghosts of that past still haunt their writing.
The more general question about genes and intelligence, I think we are more open to that. And I'm not sure whether that's a political change, that we don't have, how would you put it, the same mass of people on the left who are ready to jump up and down and really protest against certain views, or whether in fact it's rather the weight of evidence having built up that genes have an influence not just on intelligence but on a whole range of different personality characteristics, and that makes it much more plausible that, you know, genes have an influence on intelligence as well. I mean, why not? Why wouldn't they? They seem to have an influence on just about everything else.
The facts don't change, opinions do. And I think it would be a great mistake to have the sort of the jackdaw of conscience constantly cawing in your ear, saying you can't do that because Hitler wasn't a nice man. I mean, that's just foolish. I think it's our duty as scientists to find out about the world, and the world of human intelligence is part of that. And it's clear that now, thanks to the work of Plomin and many other people, that you have dependable figures on the heritability of IQ.
The difference between little Johnny's and little Jimmy's grades has a significant basis in their DNA. The inheritance of intelligence is such an emotive subject it's almost impossible to have a rational discussion about it. But surely it's time for this science to emerge from its cloud of suspicion. The flurry of ire is present, of course, and you are entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts.
Intelligence, Born Smart, Born Equal, Born Different, was presented by Adam Rutherford. The producer was Anna Buckley. Next week in Born Equal, Adam explores the post-war period when scientific interest in intelligence shifted to questions of our nurture, not our nature.